We're here this evening as part of the Imagine Belfast Festival. And the Imagine Belfast Festival is a really interesting opportunity to imagine a different future, both for Belfast and also the wider world. And tonight we're here to imagine and discuss what climate justice looks like, both in Northern Ireland and across the global south. It's a special opportunity to be able to focus on this. And sometimes I think that the status quo becomes too normalised around things like this. It becomes a hegemony where new thinking and new ideas are pushed to the fringes and sometimes labelled as unworkable, unfeasible, or impractical without maybe being given due consideration. And sometimes as well, especially with the climate emergency in particular, when we see things like wildfires in Australia or Siberia, or floods and drought in Malawi, or flooding in Newry and Portadown, Downpatrick, wrong town, sorry, both of them flooded. It is easy to succumb to despair when we see those things. And I think we've all been there at various points in time. With climate justice, though, we also tend to focus on that injustice that we see. And that's out of necessity. We need to recognise the injustice that is out there to be able to understand it and acknowledge it and to be able to work away from it. But it's also necessary to imagine what a new future can look like to help us be able to work towards what that new future is. And I take great hope from remembering times when collectively humanity has responded to ecological disaster and overcome some of those issues in the past. Some of those examples are in the Victorian era. We talk about fast fashion now. Back then it was feather fashion. And literally thousands of bird species were nearly extinct as a result of the demand for feathers for hats as part of fashion. And it was a group of women who came together to prevent that, women who did not have the right to vote at that particular time. And as a result of their campaigning and their activism, passed some of the very first conservation legislation, both in the UK but also in the world at that stage. And they also founded the world-renowned RSPB as well. As a child, I remember growing up and being absolutely terrified of the hole in the ozone layer. If there's people here who weren't around in the 90s, you may not understand that, but it was a very real fear. I remember badgering my parents about any white appliance in the house as to whether or not it had CFCs in it. And as a result of collective action on a global level, we have banned CFCs, and the hole in the ozone layer is now closing and the world is healing. More recently, COP28 last year was a fantastic success with the agreement of the Fund for Loss and Damage. And that will help countries most affected by climate change and see resources channeled from those who created emissions towards those who are most impacted by them. It is by no means perfect, but it is a huge step on the way towards a more just climate globe. And finally, in Northern Ireland, we have a Climate Act as well. And I think it was, I think the best way to describe it is maybe that it was civil society-led a challenge to what I think is maybe generously described as a lack of imagination. Whenever a minister responded that a Climate Act could not be produced within the time available, and civil society went and produced one. And we are privileged to have a couple of people who are very involved in that movement with us here this evening. And as we talk this evening, well, maybe not quite as we talk, they've probably gone home, but earlier today, as a result of the Restoration of Stormont, there are departments and ministers producing climate action plans for their departments currently. That has never happened before as a result of that civil society-led action. And these things show us that not only is it possible, but it also highlights the importance campaigners and activists and civil society have in managing and creating change and building those new imagined futures. It's also, and just want to take a moment as well to recognise that there are many tonight for whom a different imagined future is not a possibility. It is not a luxury, as they are trapped in conflict currently. In particular, we think of the people of Gaza who've been facing horrendous destruction in their communities since October, with 31,000 deaths and now facing a preventable and man-made famine. Trócaire is working along with other NGOs to provide aid in Gaza, but also alongside a vast array of other NGOs, we are calling on the UK and Irish governments to use every means at their disposal to encourage and advocate for an immediate ceasefire. If you would like to, we do have campaigning forms that you can sign up to our campaigning email list. If you would like to lend your voice to ours in our calls to the UK and Irish governments around those issues, and also around climate justice as well. But now I will stop talking and introduce our fantastic panelists. We're joined this evening by Sinéad Loughran of Trócaire. Sinéad is one of our climate policy advisors. She has a particular focus in her work on loss and damage and on international climate finance. She's previously also worked in an Irish context and has excellent experience there, also in terms of conservation and climate change as well. And I was very lucky to travel to Rwanda alongside Sinéad earlier in this year and meet and talk and bear witness to some of that loss and damage that has happened firsthand. And I'm really looking forward to hearing some of the global experience that Sinéad is going to bring towards our conversation. We're also privileged to be joined by Dr. Amanda Slevin, who is an environmental sociologist, educator, and community activist with over 20 years research experience. Sorry, and if I don't read out the name of it properly, I will get it wrong. But yeah, she works for Queen's University Belfast, where she's the director of an interdisciplinary centre of sustainability, equality, and climate action. That's the bit that I get tongue-tied over. And a research fellow with Climate Plus, the new All-Ireland Co-Centre for Climate Plus Biodiversity and Water. Amanda is also a co-founder of the multi-stakeholder Belfast Climate Commission and was heavily involved in that civil society effort to get that Climate Act for Northern Ireland. And finally, we're very lucky to be joined by David Ford as well. David is a former MLA, former Justice Minister, and leader of the Alliance Party as well. And David is currently chair of the board of Jubilee Farm near Loughran. And Jubilee Farm is a faith-based farming cooperative, and it is the first community-owned farm in Northern Ireland. And it focuses on farming in conjunction with nature and based on conservation principles. And I think that discussion around farming in relation to climate is particularly important. Trócaire works a lot with farmers who are impacted by climate change. And also farming is a contributor in other countries as well. And I think that discussion around how we imagine a different future for food production is interesting. And no better man than David to be able to contribute to that. He's also on the NI steering group for Nature Friendly Farming Network, and was also involved alongside Amanda in that civil society movement for that Climate Act as well. Before I invite them to the stage, we are just going to watch a very brief video. Earlier on this year, we were privileged to be joined by Salome Mumba, one of our Trócaire colleagues from Malawi. She wasn't able to stay long enough to join us tonight. She was here a little bit earlier in the year, but we wanted to capture some of her thoughts about the impact of climate in Malawi. So we'll just watch that briefly before we could rejoin the stage for our panel discussion.
One of the most powerful storms on record has brought widespread flooding and landslides to southern Malawi.
Rescue workers describe being completely overwhelmed by the rainfall and mudslides.
The storm tore through southern Africa for the second time at the weekend, and heavy rain persisted on Wednesday.
Malawi is in a state of disaster. What Cyclone Freddy has done is to pull us back even when we were trying to rebuild because of past tragedies.
That same land today has turned to dust, where nothing can grow. Climate change has turned this into a country of inhospitable extremes.
My name is Salome Mumba. I've been working with Trócaire for 9 years. My main role there is to support water interventions. Access to water for domestic use and access to water for farming. Climate change has affected the entire country in Malawi, and mostly the impact is through the disasters that come through drought and flooding. In Malawi, we have been experiencing these disasters almost every year. This year we are experiencing drought. Last year it was the terrible cyclone Freddy, and people have lost their lives. They have lost their property, they have lost their homes, they have lost their culture. Different impacts that has happened due to climate change. And currently we have our agricultural land which is non-productive because of climate change. People are not able to harvest from their arable land which used to give them food. And in the end, they are affected, no food in their homes or less food. So for the piece of land that they use to grow their crops, we promote sustainable agriculture practices, which we call agroecology. In this case, we are looking at interventions that will help communities to harvest something at least every month throughout the year. In case there is a dry spell or a drought, they should harvest a crop that is drought resistant. In case there is a flooding, they should be able to harvest a crop that will tolerate the high levels of water in the field. Climate justice, for me, it means being fair and having that understanding that humanity is one. We are all human beings, and we should be fair in our treatment on climate impacts that affect others. The governments of Ireland and UK should first of all consider increasing their support to Malawi, and that support can be financial. It may not also be financial, it can also be technical support. We have the COP gatherings that are there. We want the decisions that are made to include Malawi, to include countries that are affected by climate change. The decisions that are made should bear in mind that people are suffering and people are affected by climate change. Yeah, so for me, that's what I can ask. Mostly campaign. It's very, very painful for me to hear that people don't understand that there's climate change. It's so painful, and it's heartbreaking for people not to believe or to say there's no climate change. So people should know that there's climate injustice, and breaking that ice, it will be very, very a big achievement and support to people who are facing water injustice.
Thank you, and I'd love you to put your hands together again just as we invite our panelists to the stage. I will refer that to my colleagues at the back. I'm afraid I have no power over the lights. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. And I wanted to start off with the same question to all of you. To give you just an opportunity to give your thoughts on it. And I think it's a good one to start off with, and it's quite open-ended, so please feel free to expostulate. But maybe starting with yourself, Amanda, what do you think climate justice looks like?
Well, being an academic, I'm not going to give you a simple answer, but I think it is what Salome talked about. You know, it has different elements. The first of all is that it's about us being consciously interconnected as a global community, recognising and valuing that we are all interdependent with each other, but also with other species, with our environment and our planet overall. And that awareness entails recognising that and understanding how our actions now and in the past and in the future, impacts other countries, it manifests in different inequalities, and damaging our natural worlds and other species. So we know tied in with the climate crises is a biodiversity crisis, where human activities are driving biodiversity loss at a frightening scale. So from that awareness, I think we also need to think about what I call socio-ecological imagination, where we make these connections, where we can imagine a different type of world, and that can underpin our action locally and globally. Because climate justice has to be about critical awareness, it has to be about action, but also the global recognition and our responsibilities, particularly in the global north, as the historically largest emitter and polluter, and how we have responsibilities to dramatically change and take action, and to support our most vulnerable brethren here in Northern Ireland, but also on a global scale, as we've seen in the case of Malawi. So for me, to summarise, climate justice is about critical awareness, it's about interconnections, it entails action across all levels of our societies, and it seeks a better, fairer, healthier and more sustainable world for all of us who share our planet.
Thank you very much, Amanda. That's fantastic. I'm going to go down the line and assume that there was subconscious bias in how close you sat to me. Sinead, what do you think climate justice looks like?
Yeah, so I guess that was a brilliant summary, Amanda. I'll try and add a little to it. But in terms of centering the most marginalised people and communities in the world in the transformation of our global systems. And, you know, it's not just about creating a green version of what we have now, but you need a total transformation. And part of that is, like, the very basic level of that is representation and participation of all of those voices in the decisions that are actually impacting them most. And I think one of the things that it's difficult with climate justice is that, you know, the facts and the figures and the numbers can be really difficult to hear, and the more you hear them, sometimes, like, the more numb you can become to them at times. So it's really important that we don't become numb to that. And at the same time, sometimes reporting on all those things, you actually lose the kind of individual level impact and the really direct human impacts of climate change, like how everyday lives are just upended. And I guess the other part of it is that in discussing climate justice, you know, we often end up, as Peter had mentioned, talking about the injustices and the layers and layers of what injustice looks like. And the problem with that is that it actually can degrade the agency of the communities and the people that are most vulnerable and actually feeling the impacts most. So I think it's really important to be able to try and keep that front and centre as well as we move to a new system. Thank you.
Fantastic. And David, I don't know if it's a benefit to go last or not, but finally yourself.
I'm not sure that these two left much left for me, but anyway. Let me take it from a slightly different tack. I used to have responsibilities in this region for what was termed justice. And when you look at the way the justice system operated, it was around trying to ensure that people were treated fairly and appropriately with equal rights in a small region across a limited range of responsibilities. When we talk about climate justice, we're talking about a system for the entire globe. And we saw that highlighted in the video. I mean, it's a cliche, but we all know that in this room, we are the people who have contributed to the problems which are being experienced worst by those who have done least to do that. So climate justice has to involve these points which we made around recognizing that we're not simply talking about, you know, a microcosm of a society of a couple of million people, or even 60 million people, or even 500 million when we were in Europe. We are talking about a global system, recognizing common humanity, recognizing connections, recognizing that we all have responsibility to take actions to ensure justice for everyone, and ensuring, for example, that the various COPs which have come up with positive minor steps forward actually have governments with their feet held to the fire. So that's an appropriate analogy, isn't it? We have governments which are forced to live up to the responsibilities which they have accepted to show that we really are a global community and that we are taking action which ensures that everybody on the globe is treated as fairly as is possible, given that, thankfully, we're now talking about climate change. Let's talk about the climate crisis. At least we're not talking about global warming, which sounds very encouraging if you're in Ireland. But ensuring that we recognise that we're already in the depths of a crisis, and depths of crisis mean that you need to take real, significant, radical action. As various people have said, something like a wartime analogy. I think the problem with the example you gave earlier on, Peter, around CFCs, is that they were relatively easy seen as substitutes. There isn't a relatively easy substitute to our entire lifestyle as it currently is.
I think that's a really good point, David. And I think it's clear coming out from what all of you have said is that, when we look at climate justice, we're not looking at a small change. We're looking at a radical reshaping of our societies, both at a local and the global level. One thing maybe that you picked up on, Sinead, was just talking about some of those kind of international dynamics and those power dynamics at a global level. And I wanted to know what you felt maybe needs to shift, or what changes you feel need to be made within those global power dynamics to help bring a more climate just future. No small questions.
No small questions, and I'm in the middle. I thought I would get to go second. Yeah, I think the all of this roots from power asymmetries, and the fact that there is this power asymmetry relations between global north, global south, wealthy countries, poorer countries, and low-income countries, and even between corporations that are able to exploit and profit from global resources. I suppose to look at it from like a climate finance perspective, you have these global kind of power structures that have always, I suppose, had a sway over what happens in certain parts of the world. So if you're thinking about like economic aid, like back in 1960, the World Bank president was saying the wealthier countries need to actually provide economic aid because that's their means of holding power over underdeveloped countries, and that's how they termed it. And when you look at climate finance today, the vast majority of that is provided through loan-based mechanisms. Very little of it is actually provided through grant-based funding. So you're actually recreating those power asymmetries by further indebting countries that are already in debt. And it's taking away from those kind of basic services that countries need to be able to fulfill the human rights needs, things like healthcare and education. So public money is being diverted out of that to loan repayments. So from that perspective, like it's powerful institutions that have a role to play in that, but also it's governments, because if you look at the climate finance that was provided last year, I think it's something like a quarter of public finance was actually through grant-based systems. So you can imagine the amount of money that's actually going out through loans. So it's those kind of things have to change. It's not just institutions, but it's actually governments as well. And I think as well, when you're looking at it, it's reframing the narrative a bit and the terms that we use as well. So it's not about making pledges, because that sounds like some sort of donation, and it's obviously within the system of like loss and damage and climate finance more generally. There's no binding commitment, or there's no binding rule on countries as to how much they have to provide. So voluntary is the kind of way that they do it, but it needs to be more focused on the fact that you're not providing help to a country in need, you're actually providing what is owed to them, and actually focusing on the fair share that richer countries, powerful institutions and corporations have actually profited and benefited off exploiting global resources, and it's about actually getting the fair share to those countries. So I think there needs to be a shift in like institutions and governments, but also the narrative that's used in like policy process and like the UNFCCC and things like that needs to definitely be turned on its head as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's Hard to articulate better than you have done, Sinead, actually, to be honest. It is a very profound reshaping of the international system and how those policy discussions even happen. And we need to reshape that at the core of it before we can even start kind of creating a more just system. Amanda, I know that is something that you have been engaged in through civil society action in Northern Ireland in terms of creating or helping deliver that kind of climate act in NI. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about how those power dynamics need to shift within sort of Ireland as an island. Maybe I know your work is cross-border through different institutions.
So the question is where to start. We start with the island as a whole. We have a problem in that we're very dependent on global trade, on dependency on foreign capital, and that has obviously environmental and social repercussions. You know, Sinead talked about the historical emissions and who's most responsible. We know the global north is most responsible for global emissions. We know that the US is responsible for about a quarter of all emissions since 1850, the Industrial Revolution. And obviously Europe, the rest of Europe has played a role in that. We know that certain corporations have played a role. So we are in a global capitalist system which is premised upon international trade. It's based on profit making. And it's completely unsustainable for social reasons and for economic and ecological reasons. The system that we live in is already disadvantaging people. If we look across Northern Ireland, the level of disadvantage we still have in areas of our region. Now, that's a big problem for how we transition. We know that we need systemic transformations. We can't continue the pathway that we're on. But for me, the transition has to start with and in communities in a really inclusive way, where we're working with people to bring about change in an accessible way, where we're seeking to tackle injustice at every stage. So one thing we did within the climate legislation, for those of you, I'm sure you've all heard a bit about our background at this stage, but until 2022, Northern Ireland didn't have any climate legislation. It was the only part of these islands, one of the few countries globally that didn't have any legal responsibilities to take climate mitigation to reduce emissions. There was commitments to climate adaptation through UK's 2008 Climate Act. And because of that, and because of political issues like a minister that with vested interests, we had no policy, we had no legislation, we had no top-down response to the climate crisis. And I'm an activist, community work background, and I worked in the Climate Coalition. I was chair of the Climate Coalition. And we began to realise that unless civil society takes action, unless we take leadership and own action from the bottom up, change wasn't going to happen. So that led to us bringing together over 30 organisations, which represent about 400,000 people across Northern Ireland, working with cross-party, cross-community MLAs, working with organisations like Nature Friendly Farming Network and others, to draft climate legislation, to set in place that legislative basis to enable change in Northern Ireland. But the key thing is we now have a Climate Act, but it embeds just transition principles. So recognise that as we move towards a new system, we don't leave anybody behind. We move towards a more ecologically and economically fair system. And that has to involve people at a local level taking action. Now, I'm not sure if I'm really trying to answer your question very well, but the point I'm trying to get is that change has happened at all levels. Taking account that we are in a global capitalist system that is based on inequality, it's based on unfair distribution and utilisation of resources, where some countries are using far too many resources and other countries like Malawi are suffering the consequences. We need to take account of that global scale, but recognise that it's in our communities, it's in our region where we can have the most power. And I think with our work in civil society and Climate Coalition NI, it shows you what we can do when we work together for a common good.
Thanks so much, Amanda. That was wonderfully articulate, and I think really distills down into that kind of live global, act local kind of dynamic as well. And I think that comes across, and the need for that comes across really powerfully in what you've said. David, I saw a slightly similar question to yourself. You've probably, in your previous roles, been on the receiving end of campaigning from civil society groups as well. So you maybe understand it from both sides. But also, I think in particular, one of those power dynamics that we talk about is based in agriculture as well, and in our food production systems. And I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts about how you think that those dynamics might need to change in response to the climate crisis.
Okay, can I just go back one bit in terms of civil society making a difference?
Mm-hmm.
I'm old enough to remember the Jubilee 2000 campaign to cancel the debt. Now, I can't remember the figures. What we do know is that significant steps were made. The UK was very positive on that, possibly because the Chancellor of the Exchequer was called Gordon Brown and had a conscience. I don't often praise politicians from other parties, but that's one that's valid. But we also know just how much has accumulated to the richest organisations and individuals in the 24 years since then. We maybe need it at Jubilee 2000 every 10 years, not every 50 years. In terms of the issues around agriculture, there are massive problems facing agriculture and food production generally in recognising the need for change. I think Nature Friendly Farming Network and others are showing practical examples as to what can be done to produce food in different ways, which protects nature and which doesn't produce the same amount of carbon, indeed may sequester carbon as a net effect. In 2 days' time, as part of Imagine, a report is being launched by, amongst others, Jubilee and Co-op Alternatives on work which was done on a course called Cultivating Community Farming, encouraging other small groups looking at how things might be done in a different way on a small scale. So those kind of things are happening. But the blunt reality is farmers are largely price takers, not price makers. Supermarkets and the major meat processing firms in particular control the incomes of people here, and it is extraordinarily difficult to persuade somebody who is producing food and making a minimal profit because their carrots are too curly or their beef cattle are 1 month too old when they go to slaughter or whatever, to recognise the need for change. The practical reality, and some of my colleagues in NFFN have shown, that you can be at the forefront of agriculture, make a better profit, and reduce your carbon emissions. If you want to go to nffn.org.uk, you can read some of those examples on the website. I shan't go through all of them now. But there are clear examples where people are making a difference. But the fundamental problem is that the power dynamics within agriculture make that very difficult. And well, I would say this, wouldn't I? I'm delighted that we now have a Minister for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs who isn't just doing what certain sections of farming say must be done, which tragically was what was happening when the same minister was unable to recognise his environmental responsibilities for Climate Change Act. So there are a number of difficulties. There are small threads moving in the right direction, but the issue of civil society pressure, working within farming organisations as well, and recognising that overcoming the power of, in particular, the supermarkets is not going to be easy, but it's all part of the change which is needed here as well as globally.
Thanks, David. Yeah, and I think it's such an interesting and difficult problem to overcome in those senses as well. There isn't a quick answer and there isn't a quick fix. But I think there is, as I think you've all articulated this evening, a power in togetherness and unity and in working together at all levels. And maybe sticking with yourself, David, and I'll come and get views from Amanda and Sinéad on it as well, so you can mentally prepare. But what do you think in that sense? What do you think is important in being able to create kind of effective coalitions for change, either in a civil society or as within the food production and farming movements as well?
I think you said it all when you said the word coalition, because we wouldn't have got a Climate Change Act if 30 different organisations had done their own thing. We got there because people worked together. We see that in similar ways across lobbying around international development issues generally over the years, that where organisations work together, there's a chance of achieving something. In terms of agriculture, that means working with existing farming groups as far as you can, trying to establish the options for making moves in a different direction, and ensuring that the alternative views are expressed in a different way. The real difficulty in this region is that the principal farming organisation, the Ulster Farmers Union, the College of Agriculture, Food and Rural Education, AFBI, the Agri-Food Biosciences Institute, all seem to me to be on a track which was the acceptable track 10, 20 years ago. And what we have got to do is to persuade people about the need to change in a realistic way. That means basically getting the evidence right, expressing the science, as well as the morality of the need for change, and somehow ensuring that there is adequate financial support, that people who know in their heart that something needs to be done actually have the capacity to do it, which at the moment, too many of them don't have the capacity to do, because they're literally looking at their bank balance from month to month, not quite sure where they're going.
Thanks, David. Yeah, definitely. And I think that whenever it comes down to those dynamics, I think that's very difficult. And I think the farming community is very stretched. And I think you're correct earlier when you say that they're price takers, not price makers in that discussion. And we do need to look at that. I think I'd love to get your thoughts, Amanda, as well, around that. Also, if you have any thoughts around the kind of agriculture element, but around that kind of creation of coalitions of change and how we do that and how we can build those effectively.
I think one of our successes in the Climate Coalition was that we made an agreement early on that it was about collaborating around what we hold in common and agreeing that if we had difficulties, we'd seek to resolve them. But the main point was that we are all in this together. And that's a key thing about developing a shared vision, developing shared aims, and working through that. And I'll be honest with you, I was chair of the coalition for 2 years, and it was hard. Working 6-7 days a week, the level of engagement and collaboration we were doing, it was challenging, but it was worth it. And I think those are a couple of key things to remember is having a shared value, having shared visions, having a clear commitment to building relationships, to bringing everybody on board. Even if there was minor disagreements or people follow different pathways within each organisation, we were looking at the bigger picture. And for me, it's only how we bring about change is when we work together. And I think the example of what we did around the climate legislation is a very powerful one. But we have so many other opportunities here to build on that, to build on our collaborations and our coalitions. For example, to tackle the widespread disadvantages we face across Northern Ireland. And what David has said is so important. If we look at the average share of farm sizes, generally a lot of farmers, their farm sizes are getting smaller, their income is getting lower, they're struggling more and more. And more broadly across our communities, we're seeing that a lot of people are struggling and making decisions about whether they'll heat their homes or whether they'll buy food. So a lot of people are living in the midst of terrible socioeconomic difficulties without support. And it's really hard to think about the climate crisis or to think about climate justice or anything else when you can't pay your bills, when you really struggle to get through from day to day. So when we talk about coalitions, we need those elements of relationship building, we need those elements of vision and the greater good. But as David said, we also need resourcing and commitment. And that involves putting money into our communities, putting money into projects, resourcing community work. We often forget about community work and the importance of the sector. But it's been so crucial to Northern Ireland, not just in moving beyond conflict, but we're still in what I use the word negative peace. There's a guy called Johan Galtung, a Norwegian sociologist, talked about negative peace, where we don't have open warfare, but we don't have healthy integrated communities. So we now have an opportunity that with the resourcing and everything else, we can move towards actually genuinely sustainable, peaceful communities, but that requires resourcing. So coalition is all these things, but we do need resourcing. We were lucky in the coalition that Northern Ireland Environment Link supported a lot of work we did, provided secretariat, provided organisation support, and all of our organisations, we all gave our time voluntarily. That's a big thing, but that's only one part of the transformation. We also need every other community to be able to take changes at different scales too.
think that's fantastic. It's also probably an appropriate point to plug the film that has been created about that story, about the coalition for that climate act as well, and their story. There was a screening of it last week, and it is available to watch online, and we have the video link up on the screen, I think, after as well. So I would encourage you all to watch that, because it is a fascinating story, and this is the teaser trailer for some of it as well. Sinead, maybe moving towards a more international level. Trócaire has been at international events like COP28, and I wonder if you have any thoughts about how we build those coalitions for change at an international level, and especially maybe with the global south as well.
Yeah, I think like no matter what organisation or group we look at, whether it's Trócaire and the partners that we collaborate with in country, or it's grassroots organisations forming coalitions here in Northern Ireland, I think it's like the role of advocacy can't be underestimated, and I guess the difference between advocacy and just proposing where you want to get to, or what the climate utopia or future that you want to see, is that advocacy actually lays out the steps to get there. And like as David and Amanda had mentioned, it's about bringing people along with you, and advocacy gives you the opportunity to do that, because you're not just proposing, jumping headfirst into some climate future that people can become quite disillusioned with, because it's so far from what they see right now and what they know right now, and it's difficult to see where they fit in with that. And especially, as you mentioned, Amanda, if people can't pay the bills, it's not something that relates to them directly at the minute. So having advocacy there to provide the steps along the way, no matter what the organisation is, I think is really crucial. And I think building those kind of like advocacy efforts across different country borders and across even different organisations is really important for ensuring solidarity with the global south. And that we are putting those that are most impacted, putting their voices to the fore, that they're the ones that are represented and participating, and like meaningfully. So it's not just a case that they have access to join a Zoom meeting, it's that they're actually there and have a role in the decision making. And I think that's where we can play a really big role as well. And making sure that anything we do is reflective of that kind of representation and participation of those most marginalised, whether it's Indigenous groups, women, people with disabilities, and so on. So I think that's kind of where advocacy as a whole has a role, and yeah, definitely trying to build those coalitions beyond just our own group or organisation and beyond just our own national borders as well, kind of like what Salome had referenced, that we're all one humanity, and it's about that fairness across everything. So
fantastic. And you, I think, probably answered the next question that I had teed up to ask, which was exactly how we how we bring along and how we ensure that some of those marginalised group, like people with disabilities, or a lot of the people that Trócaire works with are women in communities who are marginalised as well, and how we ensure that they are not left behind in that transition. But the answer is having them in the room, having their voice centred in those discussions, in those advocacy, like not even the voice in the advocacy, but the voice in the planning of that advocacy, that their messages are what is being spoken. I think maybe one final question before we open out to the floor, and I think we'll have some time for questions from the audience now as well. Hopefully some good ones, so good thinking, no pressure. But it's one that I think we're here this evening maybe with a maybe a more hopeful spin in terms of that imagining a new future, and that hope has to come from somewhere. And you're three individuals who are obviously very passionate and very committed and ambitious about the change you want to see. And sorry, that is incredibly admirable. So I just wanted to ask, what does drive you, and where do you get that motivation from? And I'll go from top to bottom again in the line. So, David, you get more chance to prepare. You're lucky. Amanda's in the hot seat, unfortunately.
I suppose I've always been a really hopeful person. When I was over 20 years ago, I began volunteering in my local community because we had really high issues of youth suicide, all these problems, and I knew there's something was wrong. I think from an early age, I had a sense of if there's an injustice, we need to do something about it. And that led me through work on positive mental health promotion for young people. It led me into basic adult literacy, teaching adults to read and write. Because if you can't read and write, it's much harder to participate in our society. Into working as a community worker, working in disadvantaged communities. And then into work as an academic and working on environmental and social issues. But all of that is for me, working, like I've literally worked with thousands of people throughout my career. But as seeing what we can do as people, that gives me hope. Every day, bringing people who take action local level and bring them out. It might be, I'm a member of a community garden, being inspired by my colleagues in that, who drive our garden, who help with fundraising, who keep us all on track and making sure we're doing our things collectively. Or it's the people that are running food banks and how they're helping other people in our community. Or it's, people that are bringing about change. And I think that's what keeps me going is we may have created an awful mess in our planet, but we also have the power to bring about amazing changes. And we have done that. We see that in Northern Ireland. How far we've come through the peace process, how far we've come on climate legislation in 4 years. From a point of no legislation against vested interests, when we come together and are inspired by each other, I think we bring about amazing changes. I think that's enough to share.
That's fantastic. No, that's brilliant, yeah. Sinead, what about yourself?
Yeah, I think probably similar to Amanda. Like, it's a lot of that energy comes from people, and I guess the more involved that you can be, from my perspective anyway, the more involved I can be, the more energy I get from it. Like personally, when I go to protests, it's not necessarily a climate protest, but I find them quite emotional because there's so much anger. Like, I'm really angry. But, at the same time, like, there's so much hope because there's all of these other people around you, and you see, like, the vast, like, variety of representation there as well. Like, there's people from all sorts of different organisations with banners, all realising that, this isn't exactly what we're working on, but this is very connected in so many ways. And I suppose that so many people are seeing how these power asymmetries are all connected, and that all of our struggles are interconnected, no matter what you're looking at. Gives me great hope. But I think the other part of it as well is that it's really easy, not easy, but it's very difficult, obviously. But as you mentioned before, Peter, you can succumb to climate despair quite easily, and I think. One of the things that really hit me whenever we visited Rwanda was that it's almost a privilege to be able to actually feel that moment of climate despair and hopelessness, because we're starting to see the impacts of climate change in the global north and wealthier countries already, and it's very easy to succumb to that climate despair because it's everywhere. And although global north countries are more capable of dealing with it because they have more resources, I think the thing that I really took away from Rwanda was that people are just so resilient. And we asked one person as well how they felt about how communities react and are so strong to these ongoing impacts of mudslides, of floods and so on. And their response was it makes me really proud to see that people are so resilient, but also I wish that we didn't have to be resilient all of the time. So it just makes me think that, as easy as it is to succumb to climate despair and hopelessness, it's really important that what we do is actually act in solidarity. And it really is the antidote for that hopelessness, but it's exactly what global south countries need from us as well, from a solidarity point of view.
And finally, yourself, David.
I suppose what motivates me is what I was brought up as, by parents who had a concern, motivated by their Christian faith, to care for others and not just look after themselves. And I think that was something which I probably absorbed without noticing it, that there were responsibilities to others wherever you were. that obviously then has to be carried through as to how you keep up your efforts, how you make things move forward. And part of that is what has been said, the feeling that others are with you, that you're making some kind of difference in whatever small way. I mean, I can look back on minutes a day in the Department of Justice when things were pretty awful. I can also look back on things like the fact that we actually tackled the problem of reforming the prison service, which had been left by the NIO for years because it was too difficult. And because I had the privilege of working with a small number of absolutely dedicated civil servants who put into place the plan that was set out for us, with the result that we now see people being much better treated and much better looked after and much better citizens when they come out than was the case previously. So that's just one example where you could see a coalition again of a bit of political steer from me and people who wanted to do things being given the cover to do it, getting on with it. And to some extent that was driven by NGOs outside who were lobbying us, but there was also a willingness internally to do that as well. I think when we look at the issues that we're faced around justice on the world scale in climate, it's not much different. It's building the coalitions, it's ensuring that we keep motivating each other when there are difficulties, because people have always got something positive to see somewhere, even if your particular project hasn't worked terribly well at the time. Of finding the way of getting those in the power structures to move, as for example they moved on Jubilee 2000, and as we are starting to see in a fragmentary way around recent COPs. But there's a lot more which needs to be done to ensure that we keep that civic society pressure going on the various institutions, not just the governments, but the corporations and the wider society, to ensure that we really do make the change and we accept that we're all citizens of one world and that world is in real need.
Thank you. And I think that's a lovely note to close off this part of our discussion on, just before we go out to questions from the floor. I think it is abundantly obvious that we are in a state of emergency. We need to act, and we need to act quicker than we are currently acting. But I think it's been a wonderful opportunity to remind ourselves of why we act, and it is people. They are the reason that we're here in this room. It is because we care for those around the world who are impacted by climate change, by our environment that is impacted by climate change, but also that those people are the answer as well. And that's through collective coming together, working together, and through collaboration. That is how we solve this problem. So I think that's fantastic to be able to bring together, in all your answers to that question, it came through really, really quite strongly. I'm going to open up now. We've got a bit of time for some questions from the floor. There is a gentleman with a roving microphone. So we are recording, just to have a wee capture of it. So if you wouldn't mind just talking into it.
Yes. My question is this, and just shows my ignorance here. There's been no mention at all of the United Nations. Is anything happening at a United Nations level with regards to the worldwide climate crisis, please?
We'll maybe take one or two questions there, if that's all right, and then we can answer them.
Hello, my name's Mark Dick from Ballymena. Thank you very much for your contribution so far. I've got dozens of questions, but I'll limit it to just one. Amanda mentioned resources, and my thinking is, where is the money? Taking the UK as an example, the public debt is 2 trillion, but there's 5 trillion in private wealth in the UK, some of it in offshore tax havens, obviously. So that's where we need to go to get the money to do all the things that you want to do. I would say to the current situation, 2% growth from Sir Keir Starmer and Mr. Sunak doesn't pass the common sense test. Borrowing money without end doesn't pass the Liz Truss test. So you really are looking at a global, or a progressive wealth tax from people like me who have resources and need to contribute to the solutions. How do you internationalize that to really address climate justice worldwide?
Fantastic. Well, maybe take one more. There's a gentleman behind you there, Nick. And then we'll definitely come over to the side of the room as well, don't worry.
Hello, my name's Nazar, and I'd like to ask about the farming. How do you sort out the problem with farming, with the farming protests across Europe and in Wales and the Netherlands as well?
Fantastic. That's worked out rather neatly, because I think there's maybe a question there for each of our panelists, serendipitously. So maybe, Sinead, you might like to take that question around the UN and what action is happening with the UN. Amanda, you might like to respond a little bit to that question around resourcing, and David, then the last question around farming. But obviously, feel free to comment on any of them and chip in.
Okay, yeah. So in relation to the United Nations and what's been done at that level, so the UNFCCC, the climate body of the UN, so this, obviously they have COPs every year, and it's hard to tell sometimes what progress is actually made, meaningful progress. Now this year the Loss and Damage Fund was operationalised, and that's part of climate finance as a whole. It's one of 3 pillars of climate finance, and we would argue that has to be very separate to mitigation, adaptation, which are other parts of climate finance. So with the Loss and Damage Fund, there's still a lot of work to be done on it, and working out how it's actually going to provide funding to those countries that need it, and communities that need it as well. So there should be access directly for communities as well within that Loss and Damage Fund. It shouldn't just have to be through national governments. Part of the work that will be done this year is around the Loss and Damage Fund board has almost fully been set up now, and they will meet for the first time within the next month. They have to do quite a bit of work on the governance structures and how it's actually going to work. But the World Bank is selected as the host of the Loss and Damage Fund. And obviously there's issues with the World Bank going back decades. I'm sure we don't have time to get through them all. But part of the work with the Loss and Damage Fund is to make sure that the World Bank actually can deliver a fund that is actually functional and effective, but also doesn't repeat the mistakes and the exploitative nature of its workings as it did before. And I guess from the more general sense, climate finance, so loss and damage being that one of those 3 pillars, climate finance can't exist within a vacuum. So while we had movement on the global stocktake, and fossil fuels are now actually being mentioned at these global meetings every year, we need to actually move away from fossil fuels and phase out fossil fuels. It's pointless to actually provide for loss and damage funding if you're going to continue to cause loss and damage on an ongoing basis, and fossil fuels are fueling that at the moment. So we can't just look at climate finance within a vacuum. It has to be much broader, and as part of an entire kind of climate action suite from a UNFCCC perspective. So yeah, there's probably a lot more I could give you, but thank you.
Fantastic. Amanda?
Thanks. Really great questions. And just to go on to touch on that question with the UN actually has done great work, whether it's through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has the Conference of the Parties every year and creates that space for international collaboration, but also United Nations Development Programme, the United Nations Environment Programme, which are both doing research and providing resources to enable transformation at different levels. But I think it's also really good, ties in really well that second question on what do we do when we have this issue when the global wealth, when very rich people are not paying progressive levels of taxation, and they're not obliged to do so because we live in a neoliberal capitalist system where it's about minimal taxation and free market operations. And we face some challenges there. If we look at the question of fossil fuels, we are heavily dependent, we're addicted to fossil fuels. We know that about 70% of the the greenhouse gas emissions that are driving climate change can be directly related back to the fossil fuel industry, and actually just 25 companies globally, 25 of the wealthiest companies in the world. So we have issues about how they are taxed, how they pay proper taxation that equates to the damage they do socially and ecologically and economically. You know, if you look, for example, I won't go into nation states, but we have a problem where nation states tend to tax the gas and oil that comes out of the country. A lot of countries have very low taxation, like the Republic of Ireland is one of the lowest rates in the world. So there's need at a local level for states to increase taxation. We know that Ireland has been really reluctant to do that because they want to be seen as a tax haven. So we do need agreement and recognition by all states that to tackle the climate crisis, we have to increase taxation on fossil fuels, but also on wealth generally to fund the transition. And that also requires further taxation on renewable energies, along with some incentives. We do know that we need to transition to renewable energies really quickly to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels. But there's also an issue where we've had over the last couple of years, we're in the middle of an energy crisis and companies are making billions in profit, and that's not coming back into states. So we need to rethink taxation more broadly and get away from the idea that taxes are dirty, that taxes are a bad thing. We need taxation. We need it for our healthcare, for education, for our environment, and we need progressive taxation. So let's start with the big corporations doing the damage, include the wealthiest in our society, and make sure that we're having the redistribution of that wealth to enable everybody to transition.
Fantastic. I think that's a great answer to that particular question as well. David?
Yeah, taxes are certainly not dirty. They're what we pay for the privilege of living in a society with public services. If I remember correctly, the current rate, the top rate of income tax in the UK is 45% marginal rate. When Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, it was something like 85%. I don't remember Margaret Thatcher being a sort of mad, raving Trotskyist. There is a real challenge there, which means not only that we should be ensuring that corporations and the very rich are paying taxes, but people who are living on nice public sector pensions, as former MLAs or retired GPs, should also be paying a bit more too, if we're going to be in any way fair and reasonable, both in this society and on a wider basis. But the challenge is how we do that internationally and stop the kind of nonsense which happens with the Republic being a tax haven. You were aiming specifically farm protests at me, Peter. I did try to duck it by talking about tax for a minute, but one of the most disappointing things I saw on news today, and I only saw a brief reference on Twitter, was that the EU appears to be rowing back on some of its proposed farm reforms. And I think there are real challenges there, which are largely a failure of education and a failure of support for the necessary change, which has left people driving their very large tractors, consuming vast quantities of fossil fuel around city centres right around Europe. And it's almost a failure of communication as much as anything else. And I said earlier, when farmers are so desperate and are not quite sure where they are, that it's almost inevitable that that will happen. There is also no doubt that some of those are being driven by some very nasty, hard right figures, seeing it as the opportunity to attack environmental legislation in a widespread way. And that has not been helpful either, because that has the longest term effects. I think if we look at what's happened in Wales, which is the one I've seen most of recently, there have been real challenges there. What is effectively at the moment a government consultation around greening measures in agriculture are being presented as if they're a fait accompli, and people are protesting at something which isn't necessarily there. And there is probably an issue of the timescale for transformation, because on the one hand, we know transformation is urgent. On the other hand, we know that businesses cannot adapt instantly, and they need to have support for a transition program, which would potentially make things move much easier. But I think we've also got to look in this society at, for example, the fact that there is now supposedly a beef carbon reduction scheme which incentivizes farmers to produce beef cattle at a younger age and gives them a subsidy for doing that. Most intensive producers stuffing their beef animals with Argentinian and Brazilian soya and Canadian barley are getting there anyway. Most people growing traditional beef off grass on the hills with traditional breeds aren't getting there, we would actually get a better carbon bang for our bucks if we were putting that subsidy into re-wetting boglands and such like than we are in subsidising the wrong kind of beef farming. So the real challenge is to ensure that we get the measure across as to how we do things right, and we explain to people why it's being done, why it's necessary, and support them through that change.
I think that's a great answer, David. And I think, sorry, go ahead, Amanda. I think definitely for a lot of communities, and my experience of it is that farming communities globally often feel left behind and unconsulted in those changes, and are often subject to a lot of pressures already around prices and food production. And sometimes those protests are maybe misdirected anger about the source of that.
And if I can come in on that as well, I think there's a real issue around misinformation, and we saw that through the climate legislation when the UFU was putting out really misleading statements and terrifying people about what climate legislation would mean. So I had a lot of public engagement during the private members' bill work and through into the second bill of the legislation, and I would meet people terrified about what climate action would mean for them in Northern Ireland, and we see that at a global scale. And David was giving that example of people protesting when there wasn't even an agreement on the table. But it comes back to that point about education and participation. You know, there is a real need for different forms of education, so we all understand the root causes of what we're facing and how we can deal with it and how we can develop solutions in our communities. We can't have things done to people. That's what generates anger, frustration, protest. We need a new approach to policy. We need a new approach to change that's based on active participation, not doing things to people and telling people about it after it's happened.
100%, yeah. I think there's a few more questions over here. We'll maybe take another barrage of 3. And yeah, there's maybe one here, and one towards the front here next. So sorry, we'll go with yourself first.
Thanks very much, everyone. I just wanted to ask a bit more about the sort of that just transition. Obviously, we have that in our Climate Act, and that's fantastic. But I suppose coming from a youth perspective, for example, we talked a lot about coalition building, and I suppose the systems needing to reflect the different marginalised groups. How do we get there? No easy question, but what does that just transition look like, particularly when we are up against a system that doesn't reflect the changes that need and the people that need to be involved?
I guess on the back of your question, for the everyday enthusiastic amateur who doesn't maybe come to politics and all these systems very easily, what do we do? Where do we put our energy in the midst of all the other things going on? Is signing a petition enough? How do we know what to say to our politicians? We've all got that stage, but kind of how do we channel our resource and our energy in a productive way that gets behind all those huge, big changes?
Thank you very much. I'm probably going to take a slightly different angle here. We're probably aware we're in an era called the Anthropocene, which reflects the negative impact on the human species on the planet. And that doesn't count what may happen in November 24 in the US, which may exacerbate that infinitely. We have a Prime Minister who was elected, and the first thing he did was cut the overseas development budget from 0.7% to 0.5% of GDP. I know you mentioned the loss and damage element. I think Greta Thunberg called that a lot of blah, blah, blah. Much of it hasn't been distributed. A recent IMF report said we needed $4 to $6 trillion a year to support to keep our climate below 2% from 2030 to 2050. So and somebody mentioned about the globalized capitalist system. I'm sorry to say I'm part of it. I'm a retired tech entrepreneur. But the reality is that we have, over the period of globalization, have defined human flourishing very narrowly. It's defined by GDP, okay? We're not getting it out of that soon. So I know Amanda was very hopeful about the collective action that we will take. The other last thing was that as much as we address climate justice, and I'm not sure what that looks like, we still live in a world where 40% of the world's wealth is held by 1% and 50% is held by 2%. And if we talk about fast fashion, we have to remember if we deal with that, people who earn $100 a month will not occupy. So this is a very complex issue. And just the question I'm going to ask is sort of more of a philosophical question. And it's about the optimism that we can act collectively as a human species. So the question is humanity as a collective agent an illusion?
So once again, lovely easy questions there. You have some fantastic questions around just transition, actions that we can take, and kind of more philosophical question there as well around kind of is collective action an illusion? Is it something that we can carry through? That one doesn't divvy up as nice and neatly between you. So I might leave it up to yourselves to self-select and see which one of those that you might like to come in on if there's any volunteers.
Yeah, I can start.
Fantastic, thank you.
So I think firstly take the question on everyday activists and people that want to get involved and maybe not so involved in the politics end of it. By all means, do whatever you can, like honestly, whatever you can. And I think one of the best things you can do actually is to find a buddy to do it with and create that group around you as well, because it's all about having that kind of strength and support for whatever activism you're able to take part in and whatever you can do. When it comes to signing petitions, contacting your politicians, I think the most basic angle to come at any of this is from a human rights perspective, and you can just talk about basic human rights and you will be able to talk about climate justice. So don't be afraid to put yourself in front of politicians, and they're there representing you, so hold them to account. Don't let them off the hook with it. So don't, I would say don't let the fact that you wouldn't be involved in it every day put you off it, because we all know what basic human rights look like, and it's very easy to talk about it and direct human impacts, what that means for people. So, and it's probably the way to get through to people most as well, is when you talk about direct human impacts. Briefly on the just transition, I won't go too much into it, but from the perspective of like how we can get there, it's very doable. So the IPCC reported that we're way behind on what's the kind of funding that's needed to deliver the nationally determined contributions. So those national plans for climate change and climate action. But it also reported that those financial flows exist within the world. It just needs to be redistributed. So yeah, definitely coming back to actually getting around those power asymmetries within institutions and governments will be key. And when you look at it as well, since the Paris Agreement was signed, bank financing has provided 3.2 trillion to the fossil fuel industry and another 370 billion to the largest industrial agri-business companies in the global south. So if that kind of money can go to harmful industries, it can certainly become back around to just transition. And the kind of taxes that were talked about earlier, by all means can be used to fund international climate finance, but part of that can also be kept domestically as well for just transition needs. And actually Stamp Out Poverty in the UK are working on climate damage tax work as well, so they have some interesting info around that. To talk briefly about optimism and, is collective action possible? Just firstly, on the point of the Anthropocene, I think sometimes using the Anthropocene can make it seem like all of the world is to blame, and I'm not picking on you, I'm picking on the term, that all of humanity is equally to blame, and ultimately it's down to those power asymmetries again. It's the historically high emitting countries and those that are most capable of providing climate finance that need to go first, fastest and furthest as well. So I think that's kind of one of the things that we need to always keep in our mind. And sometimes talking about the Anthropocene as well, it kind of labels all people as bad, and there's a lot of people that want to do good in the world. So I think that's part of it. I think in terms of is collective action possible and kind of achieve what we want, I think it's our only hope. Because if we don't have the numbers behind us, it's very, very difficult to actually ignore mass movements and the I suppose collective gathering of many, many people. Thousands of people on the streets for protests is impossible to ignore. And if all those thousands of people are banging on their politicians' doors as well, I think that's where we can make change happen.
Just to remind you, I appreciate the thousands of people. It was 1 million people marched to stop the Iraq war. It didn't stop it. My concern is that we need to re-educate a new generation. I have my own charitable foundation. We work with lots of young people, and there's a huge lack of disengagement I see with young people in terms of the issues that affect their future, whether it be climate or social justice or whatever. And I'm finding it really hard to get them engaged in this process. About what I said to them was that the greatest threat to your future are actually you and your failure to engage in shaping that future. I mean, Noam Chomsky, remember when I was on, which he said the greatest threat to our future, and he highlighted in 4 areas. He said the fourth was pandemic, third was nuclear war, second was climate, but the most important thing was greatest threat to our future, he said, was a disengaged and an uninformed electorate. I think around this issue, we could do a lot more in terms of education, in terms of getting our schools to embed in civics the issues around climate and all other issues that affect. So I think we have a challenge about getting that broader engagement even today around the issue around climate.
I think, sorry, just maybe to jump in myself there, and it just picks up on one of the things that Sinéad said a second ago, is that collective action is, when we think of it as not being effective, it is because, in part, that there is collective action on the other side opposing that as well. And you referenced the finance flows that are still going to sponsor fossil fuels now. There is, collective action is necessary from climate activists because there is a status quo, a way of doing things, a system of operating that people do want to protect, do aspire to protect, and are currently engaged in trying to do that. And we have seen that at the most recent COP. One of the, I think, was it the number of fossil fuel lobbyists at COP was immense and much larger than the entire Irish delegation that attended. So, if collective action works in opposition, collective action also works in achieving climate change as well, or achieving a response to climate change. I don't know if you wanted to pick up anything further. Maybe Amanda, you wanted to.
Just briefly to say, I think that's where the steps for advocacy are really important, and making sure that people see a place for themselves and how they can be involved, and also see how whatever it is that they're concerned about is part of this too. So I think that's probably where all of that can come together. But I'll pass over to Amanda.
Yeah, advocacy is certainly a key element in how we bring about change, and I agree education's actually even more important in my view. And it's not just schools, it's for everybody. It's all ages of our life course. And actually it's us, that are now at a certain age and older who have contributed the most that need to learn more about these issues to understand what exactly is going on and what we can do about it. So this sort of space, this whole festival is a really nice example of an informal learning environment. But we need to ramp up education. We need to make learning about these issues accessible in every community, and that's something I feel really passionate about as a former community educators. How do we help community groups, voluntary groups, every community, every town hall, every village centre should have courses on climate education for everybody. And we also need to provide opportunities for schools and everybody else. But it's not just telling you the bare facts, it's also about empowering people with the skills and knowledge to bring about change. So we need action-oriented education. I'm very fond of a Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire, we talked about education as the point of critical consciousness raising, where we're understanding, changing how we view our world, and underpinned by this reflection to underpin action. And that's what we need on a global scale. So I'm going to come back to you on the question of Anthropocene in a second, but I wanted just to say to the lady in the back, you made a really good point there about sometimes politics seems really scary, and I agree with Sinéad too. Our elected representatives are human, and we're sitting beside one here on the stage, and they're responsible to us. They might not like to think that, but I also understand your point about where do we start, and I think find out what's most important to you. I like Sinead's suggestion of find a buddy, but there's so many things we can all do and contribute to collective movements, and maybe not in a vocal way as being on the streets, although that's important. It might be around helping to reduce plastics in your local community, trying to cut out plastic waste, maybe supporting great examples of refill shops, different cooperatives. There's a brilliant place in Derry, Ethical Way, which has a refill shop. It has a vegan cafe. You find what matters to you. So if it's about food, maybe you want to think about how you can reduce your carbon footprint through food. Maybe it's around joining groups that focus on that. If it's about energy, can you get involved in an energy co-op? Find your pathway, find your passion. Take a bit of time to think about that. And then reach out and find the people that are doing that. Or if you don't have those networks, build them. Because that's how we build social movements. It's about people connecting with each other. That's how Extinction Rebellion started. That's how a lot of social movements, suffragette movements. It's about people talking to each other, problematising issues, and finding out how you find the solutions that are most important to you. And that does involve an element of education, but it also involves change. And I think that's really ties in again with this person's question on young people and youth participation in just transition. The whole concept of just transition really emerged from the workers' movement, and particularly people working in fossil fuel industries, really afraid that if we stop extracting oil or coal or gas, people will be left without jobs. And we see really damning examples of poor transitions across the world, and particularly on this island. We look at it happen in the Midlands, and people depend on turf and working in Bord na Móna for their jobs and not being offered pathways for change. So part of this broader educational piece is around understanding what's going on and what the solutions are, but also upskilling people for green jobs and encouraging opportunities for people to, whether it's reskilling in adulthood or whether it's around leaving secondary school and going into university or college, that there are opportunities available to us. And that's a real point. I think it's really important for the youth movement as well to be going straight at universities, going to college, and we want more green jobs. I work in a university, and I'm not going to go into details about the challenge it has been to try and advance resourcing for us to teach about. Now, our universities improved a lot in the last couple of years, but it's been a challenge, and we need more people to talk about it. Why don't we have 50 degrees in these areas, or why don't we have these pathways? Because we need both educational opportunities for people to embark on pathways that will enable just transition. So we need to have more people who can work on solar panels, who can work on micro-generations, people who can retrofit homes, for people who can work in communities and educate people in communities about what's going on. And that comes from the education system more broadly, but it also is tied in with training, it's tied in with social movements and how we advocate for what we need. So all these things are really tied in. Education's really tied in, social movements, find out what needs to happen. And our young people are so important, because you're being saddled with a future that is damaged by us. And particularly young people in the Global South whose family, whose ancestors haven't done the damage that they're living through. So there is an element there of just transition. It's bringing everybody around. It's enabling supports for those that are in carbon intensive industries, and including not just those working in coal mines and working on the oil rigs, farmers and others whose industries have large carbon footprints. And then that does tie into the last series of questions you have asked and raised around the Anthropocene, which is known as a geological epoch, where humans are the main drivers of changes to their system. It can be useful as a framing of the planetary crises. I don't use the term that often in public anymore because it doesn't always encapsulate the reality of where we're at. And a couple of things of what you said about some of the challenge we face. With PM cut Overseas Development Fund, he's opened up new licenses for oil and gas extraction. We're seeing such little attention to environment and a sustainable future. And again, that comes back onto the mechanisms that we have to change that. Because we can't let that state of affairs continue. We can't have an ecocidal government determine the future for millions of people and billions across the planet. But I think it really ties in with these other themes. And I'm conscious that you want me to wrap up anytime soon, about how do we move beyond measured GDP, where the baseline of success is how much money is in an economy. And there are nice precedents across the world, whether it's Bhutan and the happiness index, where the philosophical viewpoint is different. It's about people living in harmony with each other and with nature. And it's really special. I have a good Bhutanese friend who talked to me about his background, his philosophy, and the way of life being very different. And there's something about how we change our thinking about what happiness is, what flourishing looks like, what successful communities look like. It's not about money, because we see that focusing on money and economic growth is deepening inequalities across our country, across our planet. For the health of our planet, for the health of our communities, we need different ways of doing it. So I think something like the happiness index and life satisfaction is really important, but also tying that in with the shift in thinking and education about what our society is about, what our purpose as humans are. And I don't agree with your idea that it's an illusion, that humanity as a collective agency is an illusion. There's different philosophical viewpoints. We all have different philosophical viewpoints.
It's interesting you said, the reason why I made that comment, it was made by an American political philosopher.
Yeah.
A nation state is an illusion. And anyway, my father came here in the 1950s of a Hindu background. I don't have a faith, fortunately for me, but that's another question. But in that philosophy, they actually call this era even worse than the Anthropocene. They call it Kalyuga, which is the end era. And that has been, this was written 5,000 or 6,000 years ago in Hindu scripture. So he's even more negative about how we can work as a collective species. And the work I do with young people through my foundation, I'm finding it difficult to see that connection. And I think there's a huge challenge for our generation to spend time with this generation to get them to take part in rebuilding and contributing to their future. And that's a big challenge.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a big challenge too for other people of our generations to take part in that as well, because we're taught and we're socialised into being individuals. We're taught to think about our individual pathways, our careers, our money, our whatever we have. That's not a healthy way to be in terms of that preoccupation. That ties in again with that, how do we measure happiness and what success is. So there's something about how we should, it goes back to the point I made earlier about a socio-ecological imagination, where we learn to think differently, where we learn to connect with each other, understand our mutual interdependencies, not just as humans, our interdependence with other species. Bees, for example. We can't live without bees. We need bees for pollination for our food. But yet we're killing bees at an alarming rate. Our natural world more broadly. But if we rethink our imaginations, if we have to reimagine our relationships with each other, with other species, and reimagine what our world could be like, where we're not exploiting our environment, where we're not exploiting other people, where we're living in harmony and focus on a common good, and I think that's possible.
David.
Is there anything left there?
Yeah. So it's getting a bit of a roll.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the just transition issue seems to be one of the key things that we don't have easy answers, and yet it's so vital that we ensure that people recognise the need for transition and they change with it. I mean, Radio 4 today had a report on the pending South African elections. South Africa, the South, not like us. The ANC party is in danger of losing the support of one of its key components, the Coal Miners Union, over the issue of phasing out fossil fuels. So these issues are not simple. They're similar in different parts of the world, and we need to find a way of presenting it right. So I'm going to duck that issue of just transition and leave it there with the problem. In terms of where people should put their energy, what they should do, go home, look up the Trócaire website, look up the Loughran website, look up the Christian Aid website, look up the Extinction Rebellion website. If you can't find something there which is your particular interest to follow through, then you're in a bad way. Go and find the local refill shop, and then tell your friends and neighbours why you're going there.
It's closing down. Yeah, very sad about that.
Well, sorry, the one
Still
that
some across the more west of the province.
the one that we patronise in Brishane isn't, as far as I know. But it's getting that local very personal education thing, as well as the lobbying. Politicians, if they're lobbied, have to respond if they're concerned about their seat. And mostly with elections about to pen for Westminster, they're concerned about their seat. So use it as the opportunity to email people. I mean, I know somebody who emails our local DUP MP and signs it with the surname Ford, and despite that, still gets a reply every time. Because MPs feel the need to respond to what constituents are saying. I'm fairly sure that person will never vote for him, but that's not the point. So it's get that level of lobbying, both at an individual speaking to people and at the tackling the sources of power. And when you're chasing one MP, don't forget you've got 5 MLAs and between 5 and 7 local councillors as well, all of whom may have particular remits in particular areas, all of whom need to be done. The issue about whether collective human action is an illusion, I have to respond to. We didn't necessarily get 51% of the population of Northern Ireland on the streets calling for a Climate Act, but we got an adequate number of people to show the strength of feeling. So we will never get the majority to do whatever we want in terms of engaging in activism, but there is a challenge to get as many people as possible active, and there's also a challenge to be as effective as possible in the groups that you're in to ensure that the message gets across and those in power are forced to act. Some of them will be relatively keen to and are merely looking for a bit of support so they can stand up to others. Others may need their arm twisted as much as gentle persuasion. But if you do that, we have the chance of building the coalitions which will make the real difference. If you don't do anything of it, then we certainly won't.
Fantastic. I think we have time maybe for 1 or 2 brief remaining questions. If there are any, and I'm going to, there's one there, and I work with that gentleman, so I have to let him have a go.
Thanks, abusing my privilege. Very quick, just follow-on question to David. I'm going to pick on you because you're spilling the beans now as a former parliamentarian. I just want to ask, as a politician, if you receive handwritten letters, are they more impactful than, say, online petitions? So say if you received 1,000 emails from an online petition, carbon copy, or you received just 100 different handwritten letters, what's more impactful? What shows a politician that there's actually votes in an issue?
To choose a difficult and contentious issue, when the issue of potential reforms to allow abortion in the cases of fatal fetal abnormalities were being considered by the Department of Justice, I think we got something like 20,000 postcards on one side. We got a much smaller number of detailed letters, individually written and lobbying by organizations which could quote the full details on the other side. Just signing a postcard doesn't take anything. Actually writing a letter, it's the same thing, for example, with planning legislation. If people can write a letter on the basis of what planning law says, as opposed to merely signing a printed form, it's much more chance that it'll be taken notice of.
Thanks.
I think
really
that's
useful to know.
Yeah, fantastic to know. I'm definitely going to include a lot more detail in my emails to my local MP after that.
And when you're encouraging people to lobby their MP, give them, you may wish to include some of the following points, whatever's relevant for you, as opposed to just take this blanket email. Because it really annoys the MP staff because they then have to properly answer them as opposed to just having one blanket response which covers everything.
That's fantastic. That's a brilliant question and a brilliant response as well. And I think a great note. I'm conscious of the time, and I'm also conscious that some people here may need to rely on Northern Ireland's somewhat whimsical public transport to get back to their places of residence tonight. But a brilliant note to end on, I think, on a more tactical note as well in terms of how we go about that change. And I think if you're anything like me, you've found this evening very inspiring. I think it's been fantastic to listen to our 3 panelists and to hear some of the questions as well from yourselves as a wonderful audience. It is inspiring to I think go back to that point as well about thinking of, the reason why we do care about this is our common humanity. And the answer to this as well is through collective action with our common humanity. And that's going to be my big takeaway from tonight as well. I'd just like to thank a few people very quickly before we close. I'd like to thank the Accidental Theatre for hosting us here this evening. It's a brilliant venue, and the team here have been very helpful. So thank you very much to them for their hospitality. I'd like to thank my Trócaire colleagues who helped organise the event, and especially Nick, who's standing at the back, who put in a lot of work to make tonight happen. And I'd also like to thank our fantastic volunteers who made a lovely tapestry over here as well. And finally, I'd like to thank yourselves as an absolutely fantastic audience. I think it was fantastic discussion and fantastic questions that we received from you. So thank you so much for being so engaged in such an interesting topic. And finally, to thank our 3 wonderful panelists. I'm sure you'll give me a round of applause for them, for their fantastic insights.